Hello and good afternoon to our last panel in the frame of our symposium, Politische Dimensionen kultureller Bildung, Political Dimension of Cultural Education. The reason why I'm talking English to you now is that we would like to widen the scope of our discussion internationally. So beforehand, we've included the German museum scenery. Now we're going to enhance our discussion. And we have a colleague from Portland who is with us, where it's early, not even in the morning, it's right in the night. And that's Mike Morawski. He's going to talk with us later on. And at the core of the discussion of our last panel is the tentative museum definition. Our question was, when we were preparing this panel, was whether this new museum definition strengthens the importance of museum education. And for those of you who might not be aware so much of the discussion, I'm giving a broad overview what happened, and then our first speaker, which is Léontine Meijer-van Mensch, who is an expert on this discussion, will give you further insights. So could you please put the first slide? In 2016, the General Conference of ICOM took the decision to examine the current museum definition and founded a new committee. And this committee on museum definition, prospect and potentials was initiating a participatory process with a broad dialogue with experts and with different chapters. And one had the chance to propose a new museum definition. So this new museum definition was introduced at the General Assembly, the Extraordinary General Assembly in Kyoto. And you can see it here now on the screen. And there was meant to be a vote on this definition, but eventually the vote had to be postponed because of controversial discussions. And that's the second screen. We are now with the old, so to say, definition. Old means it's from 2007 from the General Assembly in Vienna. It's a little shorter. And there is the appointment of a new standing committee, which is meant to come up with maybe a new museum definition in the next years. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Léontine Meijer-van Mensch. She is director of the ethnographic collections of Saxony, the Völkerkundemuseen in Leipzig, Dresden, and Herrnhut, which became part of the State Art Collection Dresden in 2010. Before that, she was program director of the Jewish Museum Berlin, deputy director of the Museum of European Cultures in Berlin, and lecturer for museology and museum professional ethics at the Rijnwoord Academy in Amsterdam. She is active on the boards of several ICOM committees and was a member of the executive board from 2016 and 2020. She's a regular guest lecturer on various cultural heritage study programs across Europe. The lecture that Léontine, who I welcome warmly to the discussion now. Hello, Léontine.
Hey, dear Miriam, good to see you.
You too. The lecture she will give is about the discussion on the new proposed definition, what was at the core of the discussion, what is at stake, and what are the barriers. Léontine is going to talk about 20 minutes, and we then have 10 minutes for discussion. So please use the chat function again, or write to us on the email address that you've got. So, Léontine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And mazel tov to all the colleagues of the museum. And please start my presentation. Oh, how does that work now? It doesn't work. Oh. Well, then we do it without
maybe you try again to share your screen. Get shared. I'm still with you.
Okay, wait a minute. I probably need to find it here. Yes, do you see me?
Well, we see you.
And you see my presentation?
But not your presentation yet.
Not my presentation yet. Why don't you see my presentation yet? Do you see my presentation now? No, but you see me.
Yes, we see you.
Well, you see me, you don't see my presentation. That's a bit of a bummer, but then we do it without presentation because I don't know why it doesn't work. And I don't see myself either. That's even more of a bummer. But you see me.
Yes, I think the audience sees you. I can see you, and
then we just start. First of all, I really liked your campaign, dear colleagues of the museum in Frankfurt. Wir sind jetzt. We are now. And in my eyes, it embraces the new paradigm in cultural history museums to more strongly connect and relate to the present. And this trend is, I think, especially very visible in city museums. And that is why it is so nice that Anja Dauschek speaks later on this afternoon. A bit of local Frankfurt patriotism, especially for you, my dear Miriam. The City Museum of Frankfurt Main is an excellent example of that new paradigm as well. You could say that in our contemporary museological domain, cultural history museums have become more strongly spaces that reflect on the present, often with ethnological methodologies. And that interestingly, ethnological museums have become more historical. In ethnological museums, there's already for a longer time a strong critical reflection on our not seldom ambivalent past in representation practices and collection policies. Do you still hear me? I think so. Key word here is, of course, decolonizing the museum. Decolonizing. I'm very deliberately using a verb here. Apart from that, there is in the ethnological museological context also a strong critically reflecting on and changing of often neglected diachronic perspective in and on cultures. And today, I have the honor to reflect on the new museum definition proposal of ICOM. ICOM, the International Council of Museums, is a non-governmental organization based in Paris and founded in 1946 with a vision of peace after the Second World War. The founding year of 1946 is not unimportant within the context of my talk, since it is also the year where many European countries still were colonial powers. What does that mean for structural critique towards ICOM in the context of decolonizing institutions and systems? What does that mean towards prevailing global North versus global South asymmetric power relations and overcoming them? And ICOM is still today a very European-dominated structure with maybe still a very European-dominated concept of what museums are and should be. The new museum definition proposal was a process that took 3 years, a global, inclusive and participatory process with a deliberate focus on including non-European countries. A strategy to overcome this before mentioned year of 1946. A lot of museum professionals, but also other stakeholders and communities of interest were involved. And if you are interested in the parameters and some of the people involved, take a look at the special issue of Museum International. And I had a slide of Museum International. It's a wonderful, volume, and you find it online. It was a process that in my eyes was made very transparent. Regular reports of the working group shared by Jette Sandaal with built-in go, non-go moments with the executive board and the voting members of ICOM. It was, again, in my eyes, the most democratic process and of such a global scale that ICOM has ever seen. And still, when the final proposal was being presented, the heated and emotional hyper debate started. And yes, I was there when the ICOM definition was being discussed in Kyoto. And yes, I was a member of the executive board from 2016 till the summer of this year. And yes, I also played a role in the process. And yes, I am not neutral in this process. Yes, I am taking a stand. Yes, I do have a stake. And I don't want to go too much into depth of the process. To be honest, I'm still detoxing from it. But I would love to reflect on the proposal itself from a museological and museum learning perspective. I was surprised and intrigued by all the emotions in the debate on the proposal in Kyoto and afterwards in meetings, in the press, and especially on social media. Where did and does that come from? One big question I have, one big question mark I have in towards the supposedly too revolutionary and too radical ideas. The ideas expressed in the proposal are, in my eyes and in the eyes of the people directly involved, not so new at all. It is basically an age-old discussion. These new museological ideas and practices came around in the 1970s, very much influenced by discourse from the global South and from the global South, especially South America. One element of many of these new museological ideas was the emancipation or the start of the emancipation of museum education and the role of the museum educator. Those new museological ideas are manifold, but because of the theme of our conference, I want to focus on museum education. Again, a Frankfurter, not for nothing, city museum reference, the book Das Museum Lernort versus Museumtempel was also on my PowerPoint by Ellen Spickernagel and Birgit Walbe from the year 1976. This book, again also from a city museological perspective, this book is for me the embodiment of this German educational turn in museums. A must read in every German museum educator bookshelf. This educational turn we have witnessed the last quarter of the 20th century, maybe with some exceptions since in Germany in the beginning of the 21st century, it is a gradual process where education shifted from the periphery to the core business of museum work. In more recent years, the development resulted in an emphasis on learning instead of education. This reflects an important paradigmatic change in the perception of the role of museums. The perspective changed from institution, the museum with the mission to provide education, especially for the uneducated masses or the underprivileged, to user, the individual as learner. This also involved changing perspectives on the definition of learning, the learning process itself, and of course, the role of the museum and that of the museum professional. The still current ICOM definition of museums speaks of museums as institution in the service of society and its development. And as Bernadette Lynch has pointed out, the rhetoric of museum service, in fact, disempowers people by placing them in the role of beneficiaries and the museum and its staff in the role of carer. And Linda Kelly has summarized what learning in the 21st century means. She concluded that visitors, and I'm quoting Linda Kelly now, will make their own meanings and construct their own narratives based on their experiences and interests. According to Kelly, visitors want, and I'm quoting her, want and expect choice and control over their museum experience and their learning, providing multiple pathways and a variety of interpretive experiences suitable for both individuals and groups. The new ICOM proposal embodies, in my eyes, what Linda Kelly says to a great extent. And just to mention one, the museum as polyphonic spaces. And I wanted to read to you the new definition or the new proposal, but Miriam already written it, or you did not read it, but you could hear it before my talk started. Now, museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces. It's also that what Linda Kelly is saying.
Léontine, we are putting it on screen now so that everybody can read. Okay.
Super. The proposal tried, among other things, to visualize, in my opinion, the shift from education to learning. However, in the proposal stands interpretation. You can read it now. And I personally like the concept of interpretation even more than the concept of learning. But also, the concept of interpretation is not new within the larger heritage field. Interpretation was already used since 1957. The book of Freeman Tillman, Interpreting Our Heritage, and where he writes, the chief aim is not instruction, but provocation. I like that very much. In my opinion, in general, museum discourse and learning in museums can benefit a lot on the more integrated heritage discourse. It is less institutionalized, and you see that also in the definition. More outer mural, so we leave the walls of the museum more and more, and that's already something which is done in itself within a larger heritage context, and slightly, therefore, more liquid, I would say. And I'm myself very intrigued by this concept of the liquid museum. And it also needs to exchange more in a more natural way with communities, because communities are more naturally part of heritage, especially when it's natural heritage, for example. The definition proposal is, as Katarzyna Murowska-Mutesis and Piotr Piotrowski already said in 2015, it's a shift from museum critique, that what happened from the 19th century onwards, this new museological discourse, to being a critical museum. So they see this shift already 2015, and Barbara Kimblet-Kirschenblatt also sees this shift in the new definition proposal. So a shift from museum critique to being a critical museum. Aha, ha. And there the taking a stand as museum, a museum as agora, third space, contact zone, as political space, as activist space, an activist museum professional comes in. And that is why I think so much emotion came into the museum definition proposal debate, because this museum critique, but especially this critical museum, questions the role of professionalism. In my eyes, it all has to do with the concept of professionalism in museums, authority, control, and above all, ownership. Because basically the new proposal questions who owns the space, who owns the narrative, who owns the collection. And therefore a high degree, and I felt it before, during, and also after Kyoto, a high degree of fear of losing authority, losing control, losing ownership. And of course, the issue of restitution played a role in Kyoto and afterwards. And not for nothing, so many European countries were against the proposal. And I'm again referring to the year 1946. One often heard critique was the proposed definition was not a definition, but a vision. And I think in general, we need different definitions for different purposes. A dictionary definition sets other requirements than the membership criterion, which in turn sets other requirements than legislation, etc. And although I do believe that ICOM plays an important role in giving directions to the discussions, I do not think that in the year 2020, it is ICOM's role to formulate a definition that is valid for all situations, all types of museums, and that it is useful for legislation in all countries of the world. I mean, again, this year 1946 comes and pops in my mind. Every definition involves a balance between inclusion and most of all exclusion. The present definition is most of all used to exclude who can't be called a museum, an ICOM member. This excluding form of the concept of definition has become the framework of legislation in many countries. I think we should go beyond that. We should go beyond a descriptive definition that is used to maintain a status quo. What we need is a visionary definition, one that looks to the future. The relevancy of this choice between a descriptive and a visionary definition is recently illustrated by the discussion following a series of decisions by the German federal government on October 28th with regard to the present corona crisis. Initially, museums were not mentioned at all. But in the end, the federal government decided that museums are not counted as educational institutions, which would allow them to stay open, but rather as leisure facilities, with the consequences that they should close, being in the same category as brothels, as many have joked. Some critics declared that, and I quote, suddenly the unclear self-definition of museums takes revenge. Would a clear descriptive definition have saved the museums? Interestingly, in an official statement issued the day before yesterday, the Deutsche Museumsbund, the German Museum Association, urged the government to reconsider its decision to close museums precisely on the basis of a visionary interpretation of the role of museums. In the first sentence of the statement, it is stated that, and I quote, as educational actors, museums make a contribution to social cohesion. There are places of self-education and public debate. It also states that, and I quote again, museums are important places of experience and education and are indispensable for positive social development. I hear the definition proposal here. So I'm ending now with the words, according to me and according to the definition proposal, museums are just not neutral. Mike, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Léontine. Also for the end, and I can introduce or already say now that since Mr. Köhne is part of our panel, and he for sure was pretty much involved in this statement by the Museumbund, I also already have a question for our discussion in the end, whether your assumption was right or not. I find this very interesting.
I'm sorry that I was such a nerd with the PowerPoint, and but I hope people stayed on anyway.
What they did. I just think, looking at the time, I would like to now not ask particular questions to your talk, but go to the next talk, and we will discuss the issues you raised later on.
Wonderful.
So let me introduce to you somebody I happen to know from my former position, which was head of digital publishing at the Jewish Museum Berlin. And since he was quite involved in the digital realm, so I'm happy to introduce Mike Murawski, also to the German-speaking world. And he's independent consultant, author, and illustrator, and lives with his family in Portland. So for those who are not aware, for Mike, it's, I think, 5 o'clock in the morning. So I'm very grateful that you got up, that you are with us. Thank you very much for this again. And Mike is passionate about transforming museums, cultural institutions, and nonprofits to become more equitable and community-centered. He is currently the co-producer of Museums Are Not Neutral, a global advocacy campaign calling for equity-based transformation across museums. Since 2011, he has also served as a founding editor of Art Museum Teaching, a collaborative online forum reflecting on critical issues in museums. Mike has previously served as the Director of Learning and Community Partnerships for the Portland Art Museum. He was Director of School Services at the St. Louis Art Museum and Coordinator of Education and Public Programs at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis. Besides, Mike was on the editorial board for Smart Places EU, developing their cultural manifesto about digital activities in the cultural sector, and worked as a project advisor for the Oath by for All initiative, helping civic and cultural organizations to grow of, by, and for their communities. Mike's lecture will focus on museums as agents of change. So what does this mean? What is necessary for museums to become agents of change? What should be the agency of museums? I'm looking forward to your talk.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much. And nothing makes me feel like the sort of dumb American than when an entire conference has to shift its language for one person. So my apologies for not being fluent in German, and I should be, and should be able to participate in this, but I appreciate everyone inviting me into this conversation to be a part of it. I wanted to begin by continuing to share my greetings here from Portland, Oregon. I'm speaking to you from the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Oregon City Tumwater, Watlala, and Clackamas Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kalapuya peoples. And I'm just so grateful to be part of this conversation and part of this conference today. I want to extend my gratitude to all the people who worked on this ICOM museum definition process and all of the conversations and deep thinking that happened during that. I wasn't a part of any of that, but like many of us here in the United States, certainly was just, I don't know if glued to my TV is the right phrase, but really paying attention. And for me, I think above all else, amidst no doubt was a complicated debate and exchange, I was just uplifted and continued to be uplifted by all the people that were willing to take a stand and demand that museums do better, that museums shed some of the past legacies of colonialism and really lean towards this new horizon. So kind of regardless wherever we land on definition, no definition, this or that, to me, all of that was of the utmost importance, that we kind of hold on to that energy and to that passion of just wanting museums to be better, more, and to keep leaning in that direction. So just my gratitude to everybody I know who's also on this panel and who's part of this conference that was really a part and dedicated so much time to those conversations. I am going to, crossing my fingers that my PowerPoint will work correctly here. And I'm going to transition over to that to share my screen. And head into present mode here. And I should say, as I kind of get started, and I'll keep an eye on the clock here, a lot of the ideas that I'm going to speak about here, a lot of the language, I think does parallel a lot of the sort of museological conversations and discourse that's been happening. But for me, it's been key to always ground that in museum education practice. And I think I say that in a broad sense. Museum education to me basically encompasses most, if not all, of what museums do. And I don't mean that just in terms of formal education, but sort of just this very broad sort of human learning process that I think museums are a key part of, and that everyone that works within museums and sort of is connected to museums is a part of. And so the language that I have comes out of just a few decades of just working with communities and working with people who I think have, just grown really connected to museums and wanted to sort of push museums and take risks and experiment and kind of build community around museums and the ones that I've worked with. So, I just wanted to sort of frame some of the language that I'm using. Some of it might not sound super scholarly, but I always want to push the debate and the conversation to maybe think about embracing words that are a little bit more human-based and can sometimes pull away from that scholarly world of museums that is really important, but sometimes that conversation can kind of get stuck sometimes. So this idea of museums as agents of change is something that I have thought about a lot. So I want to throw out some ideas and sort of, I'm looking forward to the conversation and discussion afterwards with the group. Museums have the potential to serve as agents of social change, pure and simple. And I think that means bringing people together, contributing to local communities, and changing people's lives. Yet far too many institutions. I think this potential goes untapped. I think many museum leaders and professionals still remain ambivalent about the social responsibilities of museums, and they remain uncertain about the capacity of museums to function as agents of change in society. Given the ongoing pandemic and this current moment that we're certainly experiencing within the United States of continued political polarization, amidst the highly contested social debates, and I think widespread efforts across the globe to confront oppression, now is the perfect time to challenge the entrenched notions of museums and proactively shape a new future. I think in moments like the ones we're living in now, it's important for all of us, whether you work for a museum or not, to pause and reflect on the roles these institutions serve within our communities. I think I would agree, museums largely are institutions that hold, preserve, and exhibit objects and collections, but they're also living institutions that serve a powerful role as active spaces for connection and coming together, for dialogue and difficult conversations, for listening and sharing, and for care, healing, and repair. Museums have the potential to tell new and diverse histories, amplify marginalized voices, celebrate unheard stories, and recognize the creativity and lived experiences that are already thriving within our local communities. They can be spaces for acknowledging and reflecting on difference and for bridging divides. And they can be spaces for justice, growth, struggle, love, and hope. And now is the time for us to become those change makers and realize the potential of museums as transformative spaces of human connection. So around this question of museums as agents of change, I ask, how can we as individuals expand the work of museums? How can we more fiercely recognize the meaningful work that museums are doing to engage change around relevant issues in our communities? Questions like these are increasingly vital for all museum professionals to consider, no matter what your role is with these institutions. So I want to go through a set of words that I find are compelling to sort of think about in terms of museums. The first is human. Let's, I think, just start by making a foundational point about how we talk about museums. When we talk about them more as buildings or brick and mortar institutions, it becomes easier to distance ourselves from the human-centered work that we do. It's absolutely essential to remember that museums are made of people, that museums are us. Artist Andrea Fraser once wrote that, quote, "Every time we speak of the institution as other than us, we disavow our role in the creation and perpetuation of its conditions," end quote. Thinking about a museum as this monolithic it, I think sometimes makes it easier to criticize from the outside, and maybe that's part of the sort of the museum critique model. But I think it just gaining the sort of understanding of this human-based approach to museums sparks a sense of the possibility of change from within institutions and sets up a clear sense of responsibility for all those involved within museum work. We have a responsibility to understand our role in the system of policies, practices, and power dynamics, as well as our role to change the system. Embracing a human-centered approach toward museums is at the foundation of our work as change makers, inviting us to consider the essential value of building relationships and human connection across museum communities. So I ask, what if museum leaders and professionals considered human relationships and human impact first and foremost when making decisions about exhibitions, interpretation, programs, policies, practices? What if museum leaders considered the human impact first and foremost when making decisions about furloughs and layoffs as museums close around the pandemic? Embracing a human-centered mindset in museums asks us to do just that, advance compassion, human potential, care, and collective well-being as integral elements to our institutions' values and culture. Community. The term community definitely is one of the most frequently used words these days, at least within the conversations I've been paying attention to here in the United States. Just was on a wonderful webinar with Alistair Hudson as part of the Museum Futures webinar series from the University of Malta, and definitely talked about just stop using the word community because it is so overused. But for me, rather than stop using this word and replace it with something else, I advocate that all of us working with museums gain a deeper understanding of what community truly means. For many museums, so much of this idea of community is grounded in geography, how we define our place, our town, our city, our neighborhood, and how we learn about the people in this place, what connects us, what brings us together into a community. It's so important for museums to be a local place, intertwined and inseparable from local realities. And our institutions can become more grounded in our local communities when we open our ears and our hearts to let more people get involved in new and different ways. As museums engage more deeply with local residents, both within our buildings and in community-centered spaces, the more interconnectedness that exists between a museum and its local community. Cultivating relationships among museums and local communities opens up the potential to bring about positive social change in the lives of the residents we're trying to impact and work with, making museums more accountable and responsible to local residents. And I think that again, the pandemic moment has really dramatically changed who is visiting museums. The institutions that I've had conversations with are seeing very local visitorship when they're open because people are not comfortable traveling to visit the museums they normally would when they would have been, acting as tourists. So museums have this extremely unique opportunity now to think about what it is to serve just their neighbors, their local residents, and those that are able to safely visit right now. I think that is going to have a shift on museums that we aren't possibly even aware of yet, and I'm kind of excited for that. In terms of community, I think this idea is something that I've talked about a lot. It may sound radical, but I think it's also a fact that is important for museums. Our community knows more than we do. And for me, the we is part of this, being part of a museum worker community. There's so much expertise and knowledge outside of museum institutions that we and that institutions tend to reject and ignore, but it's greater than what is held within these institutions. We've got to start breaking down these walls, listen more, and rethink the way that some knowledge and stories are valued over others. A really core question to ask ourselves is when we focus on community, and this question actually comes from museum scholar Elizabeth Crook, and she asks, are we more concerned with the revival of community or the survival of the museum? And I'm going to repeat that. I think it's worth repeating. Are we more concerned with the revival of the community or the survival of the museum? Elizabeth goes on saying that when engaging with community, the museum sector does not often have an altruistic agenda. Just as people seek community when they're looking for security in an insecure world, museums pursue community when they need to reassess their roles and their futures. And I think these words echo particularly true during the pandemic, as we sort of see museums sometimes shaken to their core, and they have to make key decisions about what they are and what they value. Finally, to connect with the words of activist Bell Hooks, which informs a lot of my thinking in the work that we do with community, I invite everyone to meaningfully reflect on what it would mean for museums and cultural organizations to, and I quote Bell Hooks, to be in community, to work in community, and to be changed by a community. Sometimes these words, I think, can just be a really great mantra for change makers in museums and some of the collective efforts around changing institutions. This one, I think, is something that I've thought about a lot recently, this idea of collective, and I've been thinking about it in terms of leadership. What are some of the changes that we need to make with leadership in museums so that museums can be agents of change? In her essay entitled Leading Through the Portal to Claim Our Humanity, Kathleen Osta, who serves as managing director of the National Equity Project here in the US, frames our pandemic-induced moment of heightened anxiety and uncertainty as a, quote, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to increase our global empathy, to practice radical compassion, and to pay attention to our collective well-being. These words just have resonated with me in such a strong way, especially in thinking about how we can shift leadership at this moment of this pandemic and everything that we're thinking about right now. Osta continues by writing, quote, how might we use this global crisis to reorder our priorities and our lives in ways that increase our collective well-being? How might we lead change at the institutional and structural level with the awareness that we belong to each other, that every human is worthy of attention and care? What might be possible for ourselves and for future generations if we decide to live and lead with this value? Rather than spend too much time thinking about like traditional leadership models, I think we're all fairly aware of how that works and how that operates. I think this is a really unique moment to think about how leadership can also be more human-centered and more community-centered through the work of museums. I've been exploring a lot of forms of collaborative leadership and shared leadership models, a little bit along the lines of what Birmingham Museums Trust in the UK recently announced with co-CEO roles that they've been moving into, and really advocating for this rethink of leadership within the work of change within museums. Part of the shift, I think, is questioning and reimagining the hierarchies of institutions, which is where a lot of the inequitable power dynamics originate. If museums are dedicated to equity, to being polyphonic spaces, to promoting social change, I think we should be asking how the internal structures and hierarchies can be changed to align with those goals. Okay, here comes maybe the most radical word that I want to bring into this conversation, which is this word love. I have hesitated so many times to enter this word into the conversations because I feel the eye rolls from people as we start to talk about this word. But I am just deciding, as Léontine discussed in her talk, just to take a stand and bring these words out there. And I think maybe is living in this moment we are right now, this word just seems to be so central. Educator Paulo Freire once declared that we must dare in the fullest sense of the word to speak of love without fear of being called ridiculous or unscientific. So I'm just going to go with my buddy Paulo Freire. This concept is often mocked when we speak about love as being too sentimental or having too many associations with romantic ideas. And I think museums sometimes overemphasize the intellectual in some of these conversations. I look back to some of these ideas of love as emerging from, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King and his speech in 1963 called The Strength to Love, in which he said, "Love is the most durable power in the world, and this creative force is the most potent instrument available in mankind's quest for peace and security." This is the love, I think, that can lead to the radical transformation needed for museums to become more human-centered and more equity-centered. This is the revolution needed right now for our institutions to turn towards community care and healing. If you take away one thing from this presentation, I hope it is that you take another look at this word and this idea and think about what it means for the work that we do within museums. What if love above all else was the core value that steered the radical change needed in museums today? And what if each of us made a commitment to bring love into action through our personal and professional work today, tomorrow, the day after, and so on? What if museums created an environment in which love could flourish? What would that look like for us? What would that look like for our communities? So, going to close in jumping back to this idea again of museums as agents of change. I I recognize that I'm speaking these words in this context of what I understand as sort of this global moment of grief, pain, and uncertainty with the pandemic and all of its impacts changing our lives in ways that I don't think we'll ever forget, but also in ways that we're not yet fully aware of. At this moment, the call for museums to prioritize human connection, community, equity, and care has never been more urgent, nor more essential. And there is a lot of work needed to make that change a reality. So my last call to action is that we are agents of change. My own deep desire for change in museums comes from a place of deep connection that has grown over the past 2 decades through countless experiences of togetherness, joy, pain, sharing, learning, and healing, both within and outside the walls of these institutions. My love for museums is entirely based on the people that have come together and shared experiences with each other and with me because of these places. I've seen museums be a place where people come together during tragedy, where they feel like they have nowhere else to go. And I know what museums look like when they begin to live up to their full potential as open-hearted spaces of care and humanity. And my demands for change come from this place of love. Museums everywhere have the potential to take action, dismantle their own systems of oppression, build a more equitable future, and be those places that bring together people and change people's lives. A different future is possible, and it's up to us, we, the agents of change in this, to make this happen together. And I want to leave you with a final question, and that is, and you could, this could be your homework if you want to take something away from this. For you, it doesn't matter what your role is at all in relationship to museums, but what would the most radical next step look like? And I'll leave you with that question and end my screen sharing, and I'm going to turn it back to whether there are any questions, or certainly happy to move into discussion and conversation with the group.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for this really inspiring and encouraging talk. I just wanted to, I really like the last part, the museum and love part, also reflecting on our opening, because I always said I really think the strength of our new museum is the fact that my team has invested a lot of love into what we are doing. And I think that's when one feels in the space itself. So I think it is a very valid claim. I just wanted to go back to what Léontine and discuss your both talks a little short together, because Léontine mentioned the idea of the liquid museum. And that she's enthusiastic of this idea, and I was wondering whether your notions of that museum and community, museum collective, museum love, museum human, and this idea of the liquid museum, for me that's the perfect definition of a liquid museum. Is it how you see it as well, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk more about that idea of liquid museum too. I think I was just thinking the other day about how, well, and it relates to this idea of like defining museums, because I think that is really hard, because anytime, like, so Léontine, when you said anytime you define something, you exclude something. So you're creating I don't know, I think about this as like a membrane. You're enclosing something. And I think the best way to go about it is to just to remove as many of those borders and boundaries, and keep the frames as open and loose as possible. The only question that I frequently bring up though is, and I've talked to people who are working at or leaders of museums that have opened up to all kinds of activities that are amazing. They're building community gardens. They are working on community health, support. They are thinking about housing issues for houseless communities within their cities. And then I always think, like, are museums the best place for that? Like where does that start to, where do we make the decision that museums need to be doing all of that work? And it isn't a question I have an answer for. I just always keep asking it, and there's always really good answers to it, which I'm always so glad to hear. Because just the other day, like I mentioned, we were talking with Alistair Hudson, and he had so many great things to say about why he felt art was an important and artists were important to work with in terms of all of these community issues, that they are able to see things from different perspectives, ask new questions, and really help a lot of these conversations around community improvement and development keep going forward, keep pushing new ways of thinking about these issues. And I appreciated that response, because otherwise museums end up being kind of potentially a dumping place for anything that just sounds like it's good for society. And museums don't always have a good track record with, being good for society in terms of their past. So I don't know if that answered your question. It's still too early here in the morning. I need more coffee, maybe.
Well, maybe Léontine, you could comment on that question.
Well, it's interesting how you define liquidity, of course, and Fiona Cameron, of course, has taken the concept of Bauman and tried to work with that concept in the museum context. And for me, the most interesting museum spaces are spaces that are not really defined as a museum. Is it an archive? Is it a community center? Is it a library? Is it none of the above? And of course, you could critically question, or the counter argument is are you a museum? Is a museum professional a social worker? And what we often do in this highly polarized discussion, that it's either or, and I think it's very much end. And I myself am still a huge fan of Stephen Weil, and Stephen Weil thought a lot about the role and relevancy of museum collections, and what he says, and I'm often quoting him because for me it's so museum and still so much talking and reflecting on relevancy and sort of being liquid before liquidity came into the museum discourse, is that he says, it's not about the collection in itself. It's a means, and it's not an end in itself. And if we stuck to that idea, then we will not become a community center alone, because we will always be a museum, and also with collections. And then the liquidity comes in, and then you can ask yourself, is this collection in my museum, or is it part of a community? And we work together with this collection in state, in shared custodianship, and community work, or also in the context of the ethnological, in a sort of post restitution dialogue. Because when of course we are going to restitute, but then the connection we have with those objects and with the communities in the countries of origin is not lost, then it really starts becoming interesting, because the biography of the objects is here and it's also somewhere else, and we have to navigate together on meaning making and relevancy. And that's for me also liquidity, and liquidity is very much, it's not within our four walls in those beautiful buildings in centers of European capitals that are now closed because of Corona. So, but it's also very much about love, yeah, and that's always in general and very specific when we. Well, love can also be the custodian who says my collection. I mean, that's also love.
Well, that's
so
possession, no?
So it's yeah, but possession can also be love. So how do you define love? So it's again this definition.
Can be obsession, right?
Yeah.
So
love can also be an obsession.
True. I just wanted to, because there's one question in the chat, which I would like to bring in before we start our panel discussion with our other two panels that are waiting to join us. The question is, and that refers to the collection and the state of collection and of heritage and of us as museum makers, as the keepers, the gatekeepers, sometimes even of cultural heritage. So somebody's asking, I agree that museums are about people and not only brick and mortar, but don't markers like the UNESCO World Heritage hinder a discussion and play into museum directors' unwillingness to consider museums as people? So what is with a kind of, and there we are back to the question of the definition and also to the conflict about the definition. I mean, what is the status of institutions like the UNESCO and of this definition of us as the keepers of cultural heritage, of the things that we maybe not possess, but that we should, that we collect and that we take care of, vis-a-vis defining our self-definition as human, as social spaces. Maybe you could both comment shortly on that basic question.
Do you want to start, Mike?
Well, I was going to turn it over to you. I feel like some of these conversations are things I'm still learning a lot about, but yeah, I'm thinking. I'm trying to think a little bit more about that question.
Okay, well, maybe I can jump in and Miriam can cut me short when I'm again talking too much. I have to, of course, compensate for my PowerPoint stupidness. UNESCO is, of course, as ICOM, a highly ambivalent institution. It's also post-World War, founded in a place in time when Europe was still a colonial continent. So if my critique is, we have to decolonize those institutions, and the epistemics that are still a fundamental part of these institutions, and therefore also of the definitions that they have. Because you in the beginning said, Miriam, that the current definition is from 2007. That is true, but it basically hasn't really changed fundamentally since 1948, I believe, where we had a very different world, B, a very, I think, different perspective on what the role of a museum professional is, and the role and the relevancy of museums in general. And that goes for UNESCO, of course, as well. And with those big tankers, I mean, you see it in the ICOM Code of Ethics. Yeah, oh, ICOM Code of Ethics, so enormously important. That's true, but it says should in every sentence that is interesting. And in UNESCO charters the same. And when it really is when issues are really becoming difficult, then yeah, should doesn't bring you any further. And there I find those Nakba and what in countries in the American, you mentioned at the beginning where you come from, and you also, Mike, and you sort of contextualized yourself in a Native American perspective, and a lot of interesting bottom-up indigenous reform on what concepts of heritage is, and who decides what heritage is and what isn't heritage, and how intangible heritage plays a part in that, comes from Australia, not for nothing, from New Zealand, more and more, from Canada, and also from the States, and not for nothing. And UNESCO needs to deal with that as well, slowly, and slowly also ICOM will deal with that, or needs to deal with that. Yeah, my not so short comment, sorry.
Yeah, well, but thank you very much, Léontine. Because I mean, we want to be inclusive as well, as you said, and so I would like to include now our next two panelists who are listening already, but aren't visible on the screen for our audience, and I would like to introduce them to you, and I'm sure both of them will have something to say about what we already discussed. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Professor Eckhard Köhne. He's director of the Badisches Landesmuseum in Karlsruhe, and since 2014, president of the German Museum Association. Beforehand, from 2011 to 2014, he was director and managing director of the Historical Museum der Pfalz in Speyer, and from 2008 until 2011, director of the Rheinisches Landesmuseum in Trier. He graduated in classical archaeology, ancient history, and Christian archaeology, and curated the Great State Exhibition Constantine the Great in Trier. Welcome, Mr. Köhne. It's a pleasure to have you. Our other additional panelist is Professor Anja Dauschek. She's director of the Altona Museum in Hamburg. From 2007 till 2016, she was responsible for the construction and planning of the Stuttgart City Museum. Beforehand, she was senior consultant at the international museum consultancy Lord Cultural Resources. She studied social sciences and museum studies. So welcome, Professor Dauschek, to our discussion. Our final panel now begins by two statements by Professor Köhne and Professor Dauschek on museums as cultural institutions. And our discussion will last about 45 minutes, and then you have a chance to, in a Q&A for another 15 minutes, we want to discuss your questions from the chat. So, Mr. Köhne, I would like to ask you for your statement.
Thanks for the invitation. Great to be with you. Hello, colleagues, visitors. Yes, a statement. I was asked to think a little bit why the museums are closed down now with COVID and not mentioned as cultural institutions, but connected to, leisure industry, those things. And actually, I don't have a really good explanation. So maybe here are some random thoughts on that point, because it's interesting. Normally politicians always have their wording correct. They always appreciate cultural work. They like museums, they like culture. Everybody's saying this, but in that crisis now, they must have somehow forgotten their normal wording, and they just ignored us. That is a new situation for us in Germany. And it's hard for us to deal with it. There have been lots of statements against it, but it's a symptom that our now deciding politicians are not seeing us as an important or productive part of society, maybe like this. And I don't really have an idea why this might be so. I think, I just could talk about some symptoms why it might be like that. Museums have been quite successful with exhibitions. They have been quite successful being part of the event industry in the last some years. They have developed and adopted new styles of events for their houses. So they have still a lot of visitors liking these events. And that might lead that a politician does not see the other things a museum does. They have other changes, for example, in school, which is a core of education work also for schools, because many topics museums normally deal with are no longer part of the school curricula. That is a problem, especially for culture and art museums, not so much for natural history or science, but a lot of medium-sized museums like city museums, which are working for their community, find that the history of their place, the art of their place, which is the main focus on the museum's collection, is no longer told in school. So there is no longer a connection between education, museum, and school. There's also a change in university, which is similar to this. And there's another point in the politics, in the ministries. The culture and the museums are normally divided from the education. This is a strange thing, and we are struggling always to bring this together. But there are different organizations for the school than for the museums. And if you are not lucky, like in Baden-Württemberg, my home state, then the Ministry for Education is run by the one political party, and the Ministry for Science and Culture is run by the other political party, so they don't talk together. And the education department does not use the competence of the museum and cultural part, and vice versa. And well, that are the symptoms, as I would call it. And why has this developed like this? And I think that there has been, a lot of educational work with the museum, a lot of outreach with the museum in the last years. But I think that these things have not changed the museum really, because the core of the museum work in Germany is very conservative, as it was 50 years ago. Léontine has mentioned the books written in the 1970s about culture for all people and about opening the museums. But these ideas have not, been adopted by the museums. You just have to look at the employees at the museum. At a normal museum, I think you have 5 curators combined with 1 person doing educational work or outreach or something like this. So museums have never changed their system of employees to do these outreach things, these educational things properly. And I think that would be a radical change, as Mike has said, to try to change this in the museum structure and to have really the resources to work into the society. So maybe this as an introduction.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to give you the chance to comment on Léontine's assumption, whether the statement that was recently issued by the Association of German Museums was actually referring to a kind of a visionary museum definition. Do you see it the same way, or I would like to give you the chance, because surely you were involved in, or you even wrote. I don't really know.
I wrote. I was part of the writing, actually. We just gave another statement today. I was not involved in the discussion on the museum's definition, because that was always an ICOM thing. And so we were never asked, and we never told something about this. I think your decision is really important, because the actual definition gives us in a state before, let's say, 1970. I agree totally to Léontine. And we have to do more things that are descripted in that definition. And therefore, I like the discussion and I like the approach. Maybe it was too radical to be adopted. I was also not in Kyoto, so I didn't see all the fun there. But I'm really hoping that there will be a development of that definition, because the social role of the museum And the connection to society is really one important thing to be relevant in the next few decades, let's say. And I think that's the main aim we have to discuss after that Corona lockdown. We have to come into discussion with the politicians why they didn't mention us, why they think we are not so useful for them. And I think we have to explain, because the politicians have changed in Germany. There were really good cultural politicians maybe 10 years ago, but they all died out. And we have now only persons doing politics, not understanding about culture and what they are doing. It's really, there has been really a change. And I think we have to explain again what we are doing for society. And if we have a new definition, we really could better explain than with that old one. And I really like the UNESCO recommendations, which were made, I think, some 5 years ago. These recommendations include lots of themes and lots of points taken by this new definition. And I never understood why this new definition was such a surprise, because most of this was all written before in that UNESCO paper, and we should have known it.
Well, thank you very much for this honest answer. I was really curious what you think about that, and I would now like to give Professor Dauczek the chance of introducing herself with a statement. And I would like to mention that Professor Dauczek is director of a museum that was under high pressure because it was meant to be closed totally, and that managed to change this political decision. And I assume she will give us a short introduction into how they managed to change and what that has to do with the status of education in the Altona Museum in Hamburg. So, Professor Dauczek.
Well, thank you, Miriam Wenzler, for inviting me, and hello to all the colleagues. It's great to see you. And Mike, I'm pleased to get to know you this way. I'd much more like to know you in person, but let's hope that that is possible sometime further on. Well, a few words about the Altona Museum. We are a large regional museum in the west of Hamburg. And indeed, the museum was about to be closed in 2010. I wasn't at the museum then. I was in Stuttgart then. I've changed to Altona in 2017. But the story back then in 2010 was that the Hamburg Senate was in financial strains, and looking at its budget, decided that the 3 million that they were missing could be found by closing down the Altona Museum, which was one of the 3 historical museums of Hamburg, together with some other cultural institutions. And one has to know a little bit about the local constituency, because the part of Hamburg that the Altona Museum is in, which is Altona, which is a very, let's say, not self-confident, de-rusting my English here, a part of Hamburg which has its own history as being part of Denmark, reacted very harshly to a Hamburg Senate trying to close Altona institution down. So people really got together, the community formed an initiative against the closing, and with a lot of demonstrations, really helped the museum out of that very dangerous situation. And the argument of politics back then was that the museum wasn't relevant, that nobody needed a 3rd history museum, and that the museum did not have enough visitors, did not do enough, did not have a collection which pertained to anything which was of interest back then. The community saw that differently. The museum stayed open, luckily, otherwise I wouldn't have a job now. But one does have to say that not that much changed over the years. I changed to Hamburg, to the Altona Museum, knowing this history. And I was really intrigued by that history because it showed me that there was a lot of, missing the English word here now, a lot of potential in this museum if there's a community really behind the museum that is very much interested in having a museum. And that was also for me a very much a driving force to take over the post in the Altona Museum. Since 2017, since I started there, I have, together with my team there, which is not very big, I have to say, we have really tried to establish the museum as a place, and I really liked Mike's formula of the open-hearted space. I think we try to really open the museum for the different communities living in Altona. Altona is one could say, super diverse part of Hamburg. And with the help of the Kulturstiftung des Bundes, the cultural foundation, the National Cultural Foundation, we could install a new position for 4 years, which is a community curator, somebody who just deals with, you could say, outreach, but who really, his job is to deal with people that we have not reached before. Those are migrant communities, Black community, and the many different people who are in our neighborhood and have not, let's say, seen the museum so far as their place, or a place that they could also use and own. We also, and that was one part of the museum which has been installed already in 2009, interestingly, a year before the closing activity, is a children's area in the museum, and a lot of educational work that we've done. But we've also changed that in the last years, or the person Heike Röckler, who is responsible for the educational activities. We're really going into cultural education, which is about self-education. We have 4 schools that use the place as to their liking. They use our exhibitions for things that they discuss at school. They use the space to do schooling, which is interesting now in times of COVID-19, because we have big spaces. We are closed now, and we are discussing, can we open at least the spaces for schools, because they need space. And I think really this is something that also came up in the discussions of Léontine and Mark, is how can we be a space for people? How can we be spaces that are used by people? And how can we initiate a critical dialogue within those spaces without giving all the interpretation for the dialogue, but maybe just use it as a place to give inspiration for dialogue, but not the answers. For instance, we just opened 4 days before closing down an exhibit on the issue of the freedom of religion, freedom of faith, which is really interesting in Altona because we have a long history in the freedom of faith. But in that exhibit, we do not only discuss the history, but we have 46 interviews with people from over 20 denominations talking about the freedom of faith as they experience it in today's Altona. So I think this is a way of dealing with the issue of critical dialogue. Hopefully, we'll see whether it happens because we're not open. And also being, what I understand, in being in service of society. We are discussing here the new ICOM definition. And when I read it, I was not involved in the discussion, but when I read it, I really liked it. I can see that it was over the top for some countries that base their legislation on the old definition, but I do think it's a visionary definition, and it's something that sort of really helps asking yourself as a museum professional, do I do this? And this is a way that I want to go? Is it maybe too much? How do we deal with what does polyphonic mean? Or does that also mean I have to include voices I do not like at the museum? In terms of being, you know, of a political color that is not something more the right-wing issue. So I do like the new definition, but I'm not sure whether it's a definition that serves sort of the whole of the museum world. So that was probably too long a statement.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to ask you one question back, because you referred a lot to community, and that's also a question to Mike, because there is a difference between community and audience, right? So in general, we do our programs for an audience, but you put an emphasis on community, and you did now too, that you are, would you define yourself as a community museum? I'm also asking this on the background being a Jewish museum director, you know? So if one defines a Jewish museum as a community museum, there is community museums, but that would mean these are museums run by the community, whereas we are run by the city, and we have a special relation to the community. But I would never say we are a community museum. We have a special relation. We refer to the community. There's, of course, members of our staff are part of the community and involved in both places. But we are not, I would never say we are a Jewish community museum, because we are not status-wise. So I'm wondering if you're saying now, Ms. Stelschek, you have a community curator and so on, but I mean, are you a community museum? And what does that mean?
We're not a community museum, because we're certainly not just talking to one community. I think differently than in Mike's definition of community. In Germany, usually we use the term community for, we could also say, which is not as nice, sort of minorities. So what we are trying to do, because we are in such a diverse area, we try to program the museum in a way that we can speak to people of different experiences, different life stories, different ways of life, or different backgrounds. So we are trying to talk to an audience that is more diverse. We are trying to bring in voices into the museum, and those are then the communities that narrate different stories. So this is the way that we think about communities, but we're certainly not, we would be a museum of many communities, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, I can certainly kind of chime in on that. It's a longer conversation than I think, you know, we probably have time for, but I do agree that in a lot of cases, the word community, you know, I mentioned that it gets overused. I think it's often too commonly referred to as, or used to refer to like those people that may not come to the institution. And I think, unfortunately, like, you know, you mentioned minority communities in the US, I think often that provides a label and othering to sort of Black and brown communities within the United States. I think, so for me, community is, I feel like it's based on three things that are important. One, I mentioned place, geography, and sort of locality, and you know, some museums are very local, and some museums, you know, get 80% of their visitors from places outside of their local geography, which means they don't really focus very much on their own residents and neighbors. But I think the other two elements of it are, one really big one is equity when thinking about community. So if you're thinking community are people who aren't visiting, and I think to me it's broader than audience. Audience are people who are directly engaging with your programs, visiting and working with you. And community is much broader. It includes a lot of people who it's just not part of their habits and practices to visit a museum necessarily. I think it's good to ask, like, why is that? Why are certain people not visiting museums? Why do people feel excluded from museums? Why have so many communities been excluded from the work of museums and the decision making, and who is able to be hired within a museum in many cases? And then lastly, I think it's important, I fall into this trap constantly, but talking about community as somehow separate from museums is, I think, dangerous. I think it's really important that we understand that we are all parts of communities, and that everyone that works within museums are parts of the community and communities. And that, to me, is a pathway then to think about our museums. I love, Miriam, I love your idea that like a community museum would be sort of run by the community. I think that's a goal. I don't think that's the case with 99% of museums in the US either. So they're not, so they would say that they would need to say the same thing. But this goal that museums start to reflect their communities, that when you walk into a museum as a member of that community, and maybe you're a first-time museum visitor, you see yourself reflected in the staff, in the volunteers, in the, and not just the collections and the content. And I think it's something that museums have an ability to change much more quickly, which is like how our hiring practices limiting who is able to be hired by museums, how our pay inequities having an impact on who gets to be hired by museums. And so I think those are really important parts of what make up a community definition, and how do we talk about community.
No, I agree. I mean, that was an aspect that was running through the conference the whole time, is whether you feel meant by a museum, and who takes a stand, who is raising the voice, and who is telling the story, and whose story is it, and are you aware of if you're telling a story, of whose story is it? So these were like topics that I think refer to pretty much what you are saying, and I totally agree with the notion of both of you that community relations should be of great importance for museum works, and every museum but every museum has to define what that means. I think it means something totally different, for instance, Léontine, for your position now, because your community is not the local community, but it's a community that the objects refer to, that is quite far away, right? So how do you embrace that?
I must say I was part of the religion that embraced the concept of communities. Of course, communities of origin, also referred to source communities, communities of interest, communities of practice. And I must say my experience in the Jewish Museum Berlin and the critique that was also very strong in the whole media last year, and you of course also played a role in that, reflected a lot on my concept of community, and it also sharpened my perspective on that. And I'm now sort of embracing the concept of Erika Lehrer, the communities of implication, which is so much broader and liquid than the concept of source community or origin, because who decides? And implicated communities can have totally different perspectives and still both implicated by the same story. Just the point of departure or perspective is different. And then it's interesting that you as museum open up as a contact zone where people can talk about those different polyphonic perspectives. But of course, being now the director of an ethnological museum means that I have networks, that I have relationships where I have now, not on a legal perspective yet, but I hope that will soon follow, shared custodianship and shared stewardship with communities that are far away. And what does that mean? That people here are not represented in the museum staff, for example. That is, of course, a huge issue. So what is expertise and what expertise is missing, and how? So a huge network of colleagues globally. I have started to embrace since now almost 2 years. But interestingly enough, that since I'm also the director of the Herrenhuter Museum, which is a missionary ethnographical collection in the city of Herrenhut, which is a very specific Christian community, and there are all those issues of who represents whom, who speaks, who gets the narrative. I have the money because I'm part of the state collections of Saxony, but it's their narrative. So a lot of things I have been going through within the Jewish museum context, I'm now dealing with from a different perspective, being the director of this Herrenhuter ethnology museum and not being in Herrenhuter myself. And how do I negotiate who owns the narrative? So highly interesting, and I hate the concept, and I embrace it still, and I now have hopes in the concept of communities of implications. But I like networks even now better than communities, because it's also, again, always excluding who is part of it, who is and who isn't.
Mr. Köhner, I would like to ask you, as director of the Badisches Landesmuseum, what could be, I mean, what is your community? Do you refer to a community? Is that something that has any importance for the self-understanding of your institution?
It's this funny thing, when you see the picture behind me, that's a very traditional museum picture. You see the building, you look up, and that's what my media people came up with when I asked them to do something in the background. So an open door would be a better sign, maybe. Maybe we change this. We are not a community museum. We have collections through all European decades and centuries, and therefore many objects are not actually understood by modern people. So even more not understood by communities with another background. So there would be a lot of work on that, and we have a different approach. We have a big rebuilding of the museum in 5 years or so, and we are experimenting now with a lot of formats, with a lot of types of exhibitions, other things, and we have another radical approach. We try to use. We say that every people should have access to every object of our museum, like in a library or like in an archive. So we are trying to open up as much things as possible, and we have a first collection with the archaeological finds of our region, where you really can, book online objects. The curator comes, takes it out of the showcase, you can see it, you can bring it back. So that is our approach to work with the collection, because for us, the collections are first the core of the museum work. Secondly, we have opened up an open space for the museum, I think 2 years ago, which is obviously now closed, but was very, very active in connection to the citizens of the city. And we had a long process of citizens discussing with us. We had a boot camp for 2 days discussing what things the museum should do in connecting the collections with digital education things. And therefore we have reached a lot of younger people and a lot of people, interested in doing digital things. But that's not community work, of course. And for us, it's that way to slowly, we are not liquid, but we are working on our borders. We want to shift the borders a little bit more outside. And I think liquid is a very radical concept. We are getting in contact with others, let's say like this, and we see where our borders are, and we try to make them permissive, that we can work to public funded museum, you have no chance to force them to work for it. Yeah, obviously you could not force someone to do a work which is for people. He must or she must do this by her or himself. And we have many people they are not interested in. Yeah, they want to do scientific work about medieval Madonnas or something like this, and they don't care about the space outside the museum. And doing this work means that you work at least with two museums, one traditional and one modern, and you hope that you can, bring these parts together sometime. And this is our approach. And we are a big museum, but we have only, I think, 2.5 persons employed doing educational work, not more, because our personal tableau has never changed in a radical way. So I do not have anyone doing outreach. I do not have anyone going to the communities, and therefore we have to get in contact with them. They have organizations, we merge, we try to do projects, but we don't have the chance to do it as an institution. And having some politicians to make us doing this would be really good, but we did not succeed already.
It's interesting that you're mentioning the size, because throughout this conference we were speaking again and again about the need for institutional change, and it's also my experience from changing from the Jewish Museum Berlin to the Jewish Museum Frankfurt, which is much smaller but much more liquid, I can say, because we have a size of 35 employees. We are in contact with each other, we communicate, and it's much easier to implement change in this size of an institution than in these large institutions where you have the silos, where you have the feeling of ownership of people that are working there for 30 years, so I really think the sizes are of the large museum, especially the national museums, but also yours, has really an impact on the question of whether museums can be an agent of change, as Mike was asking. Another word that was running through our talk now, and that I know is also crucial for you, because you defined the visitors as users, and now in this. And the idea of the useful museum, which I got to know through Alistair Hudson, who was also already mentioned by Mike. I find this a very useful idea, to rethink what is actually useful for society, for communities, for maybe the environment, for whatever relates to our missions and the collections. How can we define being useful? And I think this might be important once we have to argue again who we are post-COVID. Because obviously we didn't manage to make that claim pre-COVID. Politically, you were talking about that. So the last question I would like to ask you, and I would like to ask you to give all of you a short statement on that before we go to the Q&A, is with reference to the impact of COVID on museums and the ICOM discussion around the tentative museum definition. Do you think that museums are primarily memory institutions or educational institutions? Or should one not decide about whether they are this or that?
They should be both, I think. And I think these two things can be very, very good together. So I don't see one or the other thing.
I also definitely don't see the dichotomy between the both, because memory is always something which is constantly being discussed and talked and defined. I mean, it's also a process, and you need education. You need the educational methodological toolbox to work with memory and your audiences, and also with your archive and your collection. So I definitely agree with Eckhart on this, and in general.
Yeah, I'm with both of you, but you know, with memory is basically the basic on which we are working, from. But I also think I would like to add one asset that I think was very important. We are non-commercial public spaces, and I think that is something which becomes more and more important in our society. And the question how we use that space, who we are giving this space to, who we are opening that space to, and how people can use that space, that is something which is also important for me and got more important during the COVID crisis.
Yeah, I think I'll use that to sort of loop back to the idea, Miriam, that you brought up around the useful museum, because I also, you know, pun intended, find that to be useful. I think it's a really helpful idea. I definitely think, you know, I agree with everyone else that, you know, institutions are, you know, it's important to focus on both, you know, as memory institutions and educational institutions, and there's a lot of dynamic between the two. I think, you know, what pandemic closures have, I think, shown us and kind of laid bare is that idea of usefulness. So if a museum was only an extremely fancy building that had amazing collections that people would come in and quietly walk around and look at, if you close that, then the museum is closed. Like, what is left? What is it? How is it useful? What is its function within that community, within society? I think it's been amazing to see museums that have closed. So the Oregon Jewish Museum here in Portland has been closed since the beginning of the pandemic. They have not reopened, but they have done a tremendous amount of work to provide exhibitions on the sidewalks and still create projects and exhibitions that are continuing to push their role within activism and social change, even if it can't be within the walls of their institution. Another museum here in Portland, the Five Oaks Museum, has taken exhibitions that are within its walls and then opened them up. Like you could right now go and contact them and print out all of the different images and text panels for exhibitions and put it up in your own office or in your own museum or in your home, or, you know, it's thinking about how a museum lives outside of its walls. I know that some museums within the United States have decided during the pandemic to grow gardens and provide food to food pantries and food shelters in the area. And some, you know, art museums have been sending art supplies out to public school students because they can't do the art education programs within the museum anymore. So they're, you know, gathering together what people need, what the community needs, and trying to play that role. And then there was one museum I read about that was using its own space for coronavirus testing. There was a great need for there to be a very large space for this testing to happen. So I think it's been interesting to see some museums just close, and this idea of how useful they are becomes very exposed, or maybe the lack of usefulness. And then some institutions have taken this as a challenge to be continually creative and to be thinking about what their usefulness is to their communities and to society. And they've just found this as a moment to, you know, still they're meeting a lot of the economic barriers of this moment, but they're really thriving and expand. And because I love this idea of liquid museum, they're becoming very fluid, they're becoming very liquid and boundaryless as they're doing the work to sort of stay focused on what matters most during this crisis.
It's interesting that you're saying that, because that's also a bit my experience. I mean, I became museum director of a museum with two sides, the Museum Judengasse, which I could reopen in 2016, which has a permanent collection, but that's it, or permanent exhibition. And the main building was closed all the time. So I've been 5 years now a museum director of a museum that was at the core closed. And what we've been doing is we totally redefined our mission. We've been doing educational, we enforced educational, we did outreach, we created new positions for outreach, we did pop-up museums, we were working out of space. We defined our mission as being a museum without walls. And so the task for me now is, because we just had reopened and we're open for 11 days. So the task will be now, how can we implement this kind of liquidness that we had into us now having a space? What will this space make with us, with these ideas that we all developed? I'm curious to find out, and I'm looking forward to have the chance to find out again. But I can only say that it really helps if you're not under the pressure to, fill your space with numbers of visitors, do exhibitions that are talked about country-wise. But if you don't have that chance and you need to refocus and rethink of what are you there for? What is the relevancy of a Jewish museum in the 21st century in the city of Frankfurt, which is a very European city and has a rich Jewish history, and that's what we try to do, what we keep on doing, and it was, I think it was good for us that the place was not there for some time. So now I would like to start the Q&A. There is a few questions. The first question is, and I would like to encourage who's listening to give us some question. We'll do an overlay and have now 15 minutes for that discussion. So the question, two questions. What does the visionary ICOM definition mean for museum education? Maybe we discuss that first. What does the new tentative museum definition would mean or means for education? Which role had education in the development of this definition? Maybe you could answer this question, Léontine.
What my point was of my PowerPointless talk was that almost every word in this definition breeds education. And there was some critique of people within the education museum scene, especially the International Committee of Education of ICOM, who said, we are not there, this can't be, education is not being mentioned. That's why I reflected upon the word interpretation, because interpretation is going one step beyond or moving one step beyond the concept of education, as learning is doing that as well. From Bildung zu Vermittlung in German. And it's everywhere. It's in this democratizing institutions. It's in part of planetary well-being. So for me, the concept of education is breathing in every pore of this definition. And I'm repeating myself. And please try to not focus on the word, on the semantics of the word education. That would be too much. That would really be a pity. So I sort of don't understand the question, to be honest.
Interesting, but that's interesting, because I do totally agree with you that the thinking where the new definition comes from was developed from museum education, but museum education has evolved and has shifted into a whole, I think, redefinition of what museums are there for and how they can be useful. The next question is, and that I assume is for the three museum directors, what do you focus on in the time until reopening, until the reopening of your museums? Maybe Stauschek?
Well, we hope that the time until the reopening is very short. I hope that we can reopen in December, but I'm not sure. Well, of course, we did that in the first phase of the lockdown. Of course, we're looking at our digital offerings, and we try to really put more online. But at the same time, we kept working with the different school groups, not within the museum, but outside the museum. So we really like to, we try to keep the network going that we have. And the other thing is just we were online. That was the only thing. Probably not enough.
We are just doing normal museums work, of course, collections, these things. But we are trying to do advocacy for the museums because we are looking forward and we see that not in the next year, but from 22 on, there will be much less money in the public budgets, and we really fear that there come difficult times. So we try to bring together I think 11 state museums in Baden-Württemberg to talk together and to find arguments for the next years. So that's the political thing.
Well, first of all, my main and foremost role as a museum director is to help my colleagues in this uprooted times. That was for me and is still very important. And on a sort of, to connect it more to the conference theme is together with with my colleagues, try to really reset our state of mind and not to think in our programming too much from our perspective, like sending the message, putting our content online guided tours by museum directors, etc., etc. I saw too much of it. I can't stand it anymore. It's for me not the museum definition, not a vision, but more and more thinking about who are we addressing, and whether that's audience or communities or none of the above, but for whom are we relevant in society, and how can we build those relationships or make those relationships more stronger and therefore more relevant in the city of Leipzig, Dresden, and Herrnhut. And Eckhart already spoke about it. It's not only a generational thing, but it's part of a generational thing. And young museum people and slightly older, but not always. There are people that are absolutely not interested in those sort of transformative transformative moments, and some are. So a lot of change management within the institution, and that also means changing organigram structures and really be this institutional tanker that then can incorporate those ideas of being more liquid, and that's not easy, and that takes time. That takes 3 to 5 years within the museum context, and then 5 to 7 till people outside sort of grasp that you have changed. And therefore Miriam, you were in this privileged position where you could, think outside the box because you did not have that space. And now, and I'm very intrigued with what you said earlier, I said, yeah, you're right. And now you have to sort of bring this outside the box methodologies and thinking and paradigm shifts inside your box again. And how do you make that transition? That's so enormously inspiring, and I'm looking forward so much in just watching what you do from a Leipzig perspective. So it's and organizing this conference is, I think, part of you trying to stay out of the box, although you are in a museum context. I don't know, but it's wonderful to be here.
Well, thank you, Léontine. You're absolutely right. I mean, for us, it was important to organize this conference in the frame of the opening of our museum, not to get things back in the box, but to think out of the box and to put an emphasis on that we, as a Jewish museum, for us, education, learning, referring to communities, changing ourselves constantly, asking ourselves, thinking about discrimination, and working on sensitivity towards diversity and implementing diversity within our thinking and our staff is part of what is important for us, and that's we wanted to give a platform or have a platform to discuss these changes we've been through, that we are sharing with others, and build up a network throughout the German museum world to reflect on those changes. And the reason why we opened up the discussion now internationally is because we think for these kind of discussion there is for sure no borders, and for COVID there is no borders, and for the question of which impact COVID has upon our self-understanding as museums, there is no borders. And I just 2 or 3 days ago I was chatting with Medhavi Gandhi from India, and she was emphasizing that which I think is correct, that due to the COVID crisis, museums need to sort of refocus not only on the usefulness, but also on, I mean, what has an impact? How do you, on community or on individuals, and strengthen the relation, because we're gonna have to rely on those relations once we open again. I'm sure about, and it shouldn't be only the relations to our donors. I think, I mean, that's part of it, but it is. I think it should also be the relation with those to whom we matter and for whom we are there for.
Miriam, I have one very short thing, and I promise I'll keep it short to add, because I am not a museum director amongst this group, but I do think one of the things that museum leaders can be doing during this time of closures is a lot of this talk is feeling like it's very externalized to, you know, the way museums are operating within their places. But I think one really important thing museum leaders need to understand is all of themselves and all of their staff are living within this crisis. That is, you know, in the case of Germany, you know, thousands of people are dying. In the case of the United States, hundreds of thousands of people are dying. I seriously doubt there's any institution in which that isn't having an impact on the well-being of staff. And so I think thinking about that and being more human ourselves as, you know, as people who are leading institutions, to make sure that, I just think it means operating a little differently. It means taking different steps to bring humanity into leadership and to be supportive of staff in very different ways. I know here in the US, there's, you know, staff dealing with the immediate impacts of the coronavirus, but then there's economic impact. There's, you know, children that are home from school in many cases, and it's just a very complicated environment, and people are impacted by being on screens all day too. So just like I sort of mentioned in my comments, like prioritizing the sort of human impact of all of this above collections, above the economic impact, above the political sort of, machinations that are going on behind the scenes. That's the radical act that I think needs to happen during these moments when we're closed.
Yeah, well, thank you. I thank you all very, very much for this inspiring discussion, I think. And I'm looking forward to discuss further, in whatever frame and whatever context. This conference was meant to build up a network, and this is what we will do. We will now have to make a short break for those that are in the live stream, and then there will be closing remarks and summaries of the conference in about 5 minutes time. So thank you to all the panelists. Seid gesund, as we say, and take care.